What would you do if the only thing anyone ever left you was a name, and that name was one the whole valley used like a curse? Josie Hale was 18 years old the summer she learned exactly what her name was worth. She had $7 folded in the toe of her boot, a canvas satchel with a change of clothes, and a tin cup, and no bed anywhere in the world that she could call her own. Her mother was 3 years in the ground. Her father had drifted north chasing wages after the mill closed, and the letters had stopped coming, and Josie had long ago stopped waiting for the sound of his boots on a porch that no longer belonged to them. Her family had scattered like dust off a dry field, thin and silent, and going nowhere in particular. And every one of them had gone quiet under the same weight. 30 years of it. 30 years of a shame she had inherited as other children inherit a watch or a Bible or a good clean set of table linens. Because in the Red Rock Canyon country of the Arizona Territory, in the year 1899, the name Hale still meant one thing to the people of that dry and stubborn valley. It meant the wreck. It meant the man who had ruined them. It meant a grandfather Josie had never once laid eyes on. A railroad engineer, they said, had wrecked the line that was supposed to make the whole valley rich, and buried every family's savings in the mud with it. She had grown up hearing it whispered in doorways and spat in the street. Hale, the wrecker's blood. And she had learned young to answer to it with her chin down and her hand still. Because there was no use arguing with a story 30 years old that everyone already knew the shape of. So on the morning our story truly begins, Josie Hale stood at the back of a crowd at the county tax sale with $7 and a name nobody wanted. And she bid on the one thing in that whole territory that nobody wanted either. Now settle in, wherever you are, and let the canyon dust settle down with you. Pour yourself something warm, and tell us in the comments what part of the country you are listening from tonight, because this is a story worth taking slow. It is a story about the things a valley throws away, and the truth they keep locked inside long after everyone has stopped listening for it. And before it is over, you are going to understand 3 things that not one soul in that valley could explain. You will know how a 60-ton steam locomotive came to be standing in the bed of a canyon that no road and no rail has ever reached. You will know why, after 30 years with not a single living name on the county books to tend it, that dead engine's brass still catches the sun like new money and its firebox is still kept warm. And you will know what Josie's grandfather sealed away with his own 2 hands inside the cold iron belly of that engine behind a bell yoke that hangs empty where a bell should be. Keep that empty yoke in your mind. Josie could not stop looking at it either. The auction was held on the plank porch of the county land office, in the flat white light of a canyon noon, under a sky so blue it looked scrubbed. The auctioneer was a thin land agent named Pruitt with a celluloid collar gone soft in the heat. And he sold off the failed and the forfeited like a man dealing off cards he is tired of holding. A dry quarter section that had killed 2 families, a set of freighting scales, a church pew from a congregation that had folded, and then, near the bottom of his list, where the truly worthless things went, he came to a lot that made the whole gallery grin before he even read it. Lot 41, Pruitt called, and he could not keep the smirk out of his own voice. One steam locomotive, colossal, condition, derelict. Located in the canyon they call the Roadless Wash. No road to it, no rail to it, no way in or out that any man here has found. Book value, gentlemen, he paused for the laugh he knew was coming. Book value, $7 for the scrap that a body could carry out on his back. Who will start me? The crowd laughed. Josie heard it roll through them, easy and cruel, the laugh of men who were comfortable in their own valley and glad, for one warm minute, to be laughing at something that was not themselves. That's the dead engine in the wash, somebody said. Old Hale's folly. A train, Pruitt said grandly, spreading his hands, for a railroad that God himself never got around to finishing. Do I hear a bid, or do I move along? Nobody moved to bid. Of course nobody did. You would have to be a fool or desperate past all sense to pay good money for 60 tons of rusting iron sitting at the bottom of a canyon you could not haul it out of. And that, Josie thought, standing there with the whole weight of her name on her shoulders, described her about as well as anything had in a long while. $7, she said. The porch went quiet. Heads turned. She felt the crowd find her, felt the exact moment they placed the face and the plain dress and did the arithmetic. And she watched the recognition move across them like a shadow moving across the rock. That's a Hale girl, a woman murmured not quietly enough. Near the back, leaning on a freight dolly, an old teamster with a face like cracked leather watched her over the heads of the others. He did not laugh. He looked at her a long moment, and then he looked off toward the north where the canyons cut the horizon, and he said, to no one and to everyone, in the flat, unbothered voice of a man quoting something older than himself, a bell that never rang still knows its own note. Josie did not understand it then. She would. Pruitt recovered his smirk. $7 from the young lady, he said, for the dead engine in the wash, going once for all it's worth, which is nothing. Going twice. He rapped his knuckles on the rail. Sold to the Hale girl. May the two of you be very happy together. The laugh came again, softer this time, and then the crowd forgot her and moved on to the next worthless thing, and Josie Hale walked away from that porch, the legal owner of the single most ruinous object in the county. With no dollars left, and no bed, and no earthly notion of what she had just done. She had spent everything she had in the world on the very thing that had destroyed her family. She could not have told you why, except that it was hers now. It was the first thing in 18 years that had ever, in the eyes of the law and the ledger, actually belonged to her, and no one could take it, because no one else on earth would have it. She would learn before that summer was out that this was not an accident, that she had not wandered up to that porch by chance, that there was a reason the only thing left to a Hale was the one thing shaped exactly like the Hale name itself, written off and marooned and waiting 30 years for someone to come and understand it. But she did not know any of that yet. All she knew was the walk ahead of her and the 7 miles of hard canyon country between the land office and the thing she now owned. So, walk it with her. Better yet, skip ahead to what she found at the end of that road, because that is where this story stops being about a girl with no money and starts being about the thing in the canyon that had been waiting the whole time for her name to be called. It took her the better part of a day on foot, following a wash that narrowed as she went. The orange-red walls rising higher on either side until the sky was a blue ribbon overhead and the heat came off the rock in waves you could see. There was no road. There had never been a road. That was the first impossible thing, and she felt it in her legs before she understood it in her head. How does anything get down here? Not a wagon, not a horse and cart, not through the last mile where the walls pinched to a slot barely wider than her shoulders. And yet, when the canyon opened out at last into a wide, bare basin of cracked, pale mud, ringed all around by sheer walls of burning red stone, there it stood. She stopped where the slot let her out, and she simply looked, and for a while she forgot to breathe. It was enormous. The stories had never once told her it would be so enormous. A locomotive of the old American pattern, a balloon-stacked eight-wheeler with two great pairs of tall spoked driving wheels and a four-wheel pilot truck out front, the kind of engine that had opened half a continent. And it stood there alone on the floor of that roadless canyon as if a giant hand had set it down and walked away. It was heeled hard over to one side, tilted, one enormous driving wheel sunk to the hub in the dried mud, the whole colossal machine frozen in the act of falling and never quite finishing the fall. Its tenders sat crooked behind it, half caved in. There was no track under it, there was no grade, no roadbed, no trestle, no rail anywhere in that whole basin. Nothing but the engine and the cracked mud and the red walls and the enormous blue silence. 60 tons of iron that could not possibly be there, and was. She walked clear around it before she trusted her own eyes. She put her hand flat against the driving wheel and felt the sun-baked iron burn her palm, real as a stove, taller than she stood. She looked up the sheer red walls that boxed the basin on every side, walls a mountain goat would think twice about, and back at the narrow slot she had squeezed through, a crack too tight for a laden mule, and she did the plain arithmetic of it and could not make it come out. There was no way in. There was no way this thing had ever come in. And yet here it sat, 60 tons of it, a machine built to run on two thin rails that did not exist and had never, in the memory of anyone alive, existed in this canyon at all. It was as if the mountain had grown the engine like a strange iron fruit, or as if the whole world had been rearranged in the night around a thing that could not be moved. And Josie Hale stood at the edge of it, a small figure in a pale dress against all that red rock, and asked the canyon the same question the whole valley had never been able to answer. "How," she whispered, "did you ever get down here?" The engine did not tell her, not yet. Up close the wonder curdled a little, as wonder does when you have to live next to it. This was the part she had not let herself expect. The great machine was a ruin. The boiler jacket, once smooth blue-black lagging, had peeled and blistered and hung in curls of rust the color of old blood. Sand had drifted a foot deep against the wheels. The tender's iron was scaled and flaking, and one of the wooden running boards had rotted through and dropped away entirely. It was smaller in its dignity than in the legend, and far more tired. A wave of plain, bitter disappointment went through her standing there. This was the great inheritance. This was the thing she had spent her whole fortune on. A dead engine in a hole in the ground, worth exactly the $7 they had laughed at her for spending, and not 1 cent more. She could sell the iron for scrap, she told herself, if she could ever find a way to carry it out. She could pry off what brass there was, sell it in town, buy a stage ticket somewhere her name meant nothing, and start again. That was the sensible plan, the plan of a girl with no money and no room for dreaming. She meant to spend one night, take stock of what she could carry, and be gone by the second morning. She had made that same small, hard bargain with herself 100 times in 100 places. Stay one night, then go. And then she came around the front of the engine into the shade the great boiler threw, and the sensible plan died where she stood, because the headlamp was polished, the huge brass headlamp mounted above the cowcatcher. The one part of that whole ruin that should have been the greenest with corrosion gleamed. It threw back the hard canyon sun and a hot white star, its glass clean, its brass rubbed to a shine you only get from a hand and a rag and patience. That was not the only sign of it. The builder's number plate on the smoke box, brass again, had been polished until she could read the raised letters. The cab windows, when she climbed up to look, were swept clean of sand, and in the firebox, when she opened the little iron door beneath the boiler with a groan of old hinges, there was ash, fresh ash, gray and soft and still faintly, impossibly warm, with a last red thread of an ember dying in the deep of it. Someone had lit a fire in this engine, not 30 years ago, days ago. Maybe that morning. Josie stood there with her hand on the warm iron of the firebox door and felt the hair rise on her arms in all that heat, and she looked up, past the boiler, to the place high on the engine's back where the bell should hang. The yoke was there, the cast-iron bracket, the pivot, the crank a fireman would pull, all of it there and shaped for a bell, and empty. No bell. Just the bare yoke and the wide blue sky behind it, and a thin, impossible curl of wood smoke rising from the tall stack overhead into a canyon where no living soul was supposed to be. She did not sleep much that first night. She sat with her back against a driving wheel taller than she was, and she watched that empty yoke against the stars. And she thought about the old teamster and the thing he had said, and somewhere out in the dark she was almost sure she heard, once, the small clear sound of iron being set gently down on iron. And she understood, the way you understand a thing before you have any words for it, that she was not alone in that canyon, that she had never been going to be alone in it, and that whoever kept the fire in a dead man's engine had been waiting all this long while for a Hale to come home. Stay close here, because the next thing Josie learned in that canyon is the thing the whole valley had gotten wrong for 30 years, and it starts with the man she had heard setting iron down gently in the dark. She found him at first light, though found is not quite the word for it. He let himself be found. She woke against the driving wheel to the smell of coffee, real coffee, and there he was, an old man crouched at a little fire he had built neat as a Sunday hearth in a ring of blackened stones a stone's throw from the engine, tending a battered pot. He was long and stooped and burned brown by 70 summers of that sun. His hair was white, and his hands were enormous and careful, and when Josie sat up and stared, he did not startle. He only looked at her with pale, watery eyes and said, in the too loud, too flat voice of a man who has lived a long time without much hearing, you have his look about the eyes. I wondered if you would. Whose look? Josie said, and then louder, because he had tipped his head to catch it, whose look do I have? Ezra Hale's. He said the name plainly without dropping his voice, without the little flinch the whole valley put on it. It was the first time in Josie's life she had heard her grandfather's name spoken as if it belonged to a man and not to a crime. Your grandfather. The best hand ever to stand at that throttle, and the only honest one the Redstone line ever hired. I am called Silas. I have been keeping his fire for him. Somebody had to, till you came. That was how Josie met the keeper of the dead engine. His name was Silas, and he had been a boy of 9 years old on the night the line went into the canyon. And the wreck that ruined the valley had orphaned him in one stroke, taken his father, who had sunk every dollar the family owned, into the promised town, and his mother, who had not long survived the ruin. He had been raised on charity and contempt, a wrecker's leavings, as Josie had been. And where a lesser man might have hated the engine and the name behind it, Silas had done the opposite. He had spent his whole long life tending the thing everyone else cursed. "Why?" Josie asked him, sitting at his little fire with a tin cup of his coffee warming her hands. "Why keep it? Everybody says he wrecked the line. Everybody says he buried this whole valley in the mud. Why would you spend your life polishing the brass on the engine that killed your own father?" Silas was quiet a long moment. He turned his big, careful hands over in the firelight and looked at them. "Because a man who would hide a whole town's bell to keep it safe," he said at last, "was no wrecker. I did not always know that. I hated him a long time, same as you were taught to. Then one winter, 30 years back, I found what he had done up here, and I understood, and I have never told a living soul, because there was no living soul I could tell it to who would not take it and turn it into a rope to hang his memory with. I have been waiting for the one it belongs to. Fire kept. Bell safe. Truth waits. That is the whole of my life, girl, and now you are here, and I am tired, and I am glad." Josie did not understand yet what he meant about the bell. She was about to ask. And this is the place where I have to stop and ask you something first. Because Josie was about to be handed a choice, and I want you turning it over while she does. Here is the choice. What she was going to find in that canyon could clear a dead man's name after 30 years. It could also shame, in front of the whole territory, a family that still runs that county to this day. A family with money and lawyers and a long memory. Ringing that bell would cost somebody powerful a great deal. So tell me, wherever you are watching from tonight, would you ring a bell that gives a wronged man back his name if you knew it would bring the powerful down on your head? Or would you leave the truth sealed and safe and quiet and keep yourself out of it? Tell us in the comments what you would do. Josie had to decide it for real. You only have to decide it for yourself. Silas showed her the log that afternoon. It was kept in the cab, in an iron box under the engineer's seat, wrapped in oilcloth against the damp that never came. A throttle log, the kind every engineer kept, a record of runs and pressures and miles. But this one did not stop in 1869 when the line died. It went on, page after page after page, in one steady hand at first and then in Silas's rougher one, 30 years of entries, one line for every single dusk. Not runs, not miles. There were no runs to record and no miles to make. Just the same 3-part accounting, written every evening of 30 years by 2 different men who had never let a day go by unmarked. Fire kept. Bell safe. Truth waits. Josie turned the pages with her heart going hard. The early entries were her grandfather's. She could see the schoolteacher neatness go ragged as the years and the loneliness wore on him, and then, on a page dated in a winter long ago, the hand changed, and it was Silas's after that, clumsier, just as faithful, keeping the same 3 promises a dead man had started. She understood, holding it, that she was holding 30 years of a vigil. 2 men, one after the other, sitting in a dead engine at the bottom of a roadless canyon every single evening of their lives. Lighting a fire nobody would see, guarding a bell nobody knew was there, and writing down, so it would not be lost, that the truth was still waiting for a soul to come and speak it. Pressed flat in the very back of that log, where the oilcloth folded over on itself, Josie found the small human things a lonely man keeps. A tintype photograph gone silver pale. A young man in a fireman's cap standing proud beside an engine so new the paint still shone. And though the face was faded near to nothing, she knew the set of the shoulders, because it was the same set she saw in her own reflection. A pressed sprig of some desert flower, brittle as ash, and a child's clumsy pencil drawing of a train, folded into a square worn soft at the creases, with a name printed on the back in a wobbling hand that was not her grandfather's and not Silas's. She held it up, and Silas leaned in, and his old face went still. "That would be your father's," he said quietly. "Drew that for old Ezra when he was a boy of 6 or 7. Before the shame drove your people off. Your grandfather carried it down here every single evening for 30 years. Whatever else that man was, girl, he was not a man who forgot the ones he loved. He was a man waiting for a way to be worth remembering by them again. He started it the first winter," Silas said, after, when they pulled the rails out and sold them and left the engine where she lay. Everyone figured that was the end of it and good riddance. But your grandfather came back, on foot, same as you. Every evening near sundown, all the years he had left, he climbed down into this hole, and he lit the box, and he sat with her. Folks who saw the smoke thought the canyon was haunted, suited him fine, kept them away. Silas almost smiled. He was guarding something. I did not know what when I was young and watching from the rim and hating him. I know now. "Guarding what?" Josie said. "You are not ready for the what," Silas said. "First you have to know the why. First you have to know what really happened the night this line went down. Because it is not the story your valley tells, and it is not the story that put your name in the dirt. Sit. This part your grandfather wrote out plain, so it could not die with him." And so, in the long gold light of that canyon afternoon, with the great engine throwing its shadow over them and the empty bell yoke hanging black against the sky, Silas told Josie the true story of the wreck, the story 30 years of shame had buried. And it went like this. In 1869, a narrow-gauge railroad called the Redstone and Western had graded a spur up the canyon toward a town site that did not exist yet, a town that was going to be called Amity, a town every family for 50 miles had bought into with the whole of their savings. It was the great hope of the valley. Lots sold before a single wall went up. Farmers mortgaged good land for shares. The railroad's own financier, a smooth Eastern money man named Ambrose Merrick, had come out personally to sell the dream, and the dream was simple and beautiful. The rail would climb the canyon on a great timber trestle, reach the mesa where Amity would rise, and every soul who had bought in would be made comfortable for life. And to crown it, to make it real, the town had ordered a bell. A great bronze church bell, cast back east, freighted across half the country at ruinous cost, meant to hang in the steeple of a church that had not yet been built, and to ring out over a town that did not yet exist, a town's crowning gift to itself. That is a true thing, and Josie's grandfather knew it was true, and Silas knew it, and now you know it. Towns really did that. A church bell freighted 1,000 miles was how a raw frontier settlement announced that it meant to last. The bell rode up the canyon on the engine's first crossing of the Great Trestle. Ezra Hale was at the throttle. It was the proudest run of his life, the run that was going to make the valley, and he took his engine and its tender and the bronze bell lashed in the tender out onto the high trestle in the last light of an autumn evening. And the trestle came down under him It came down in a roar of splintering timber and falling iron, and the engine dropped. And Ezra Hale rode it down into the canyon and somehow lived, and the bell went with it, and the whole valley's future went with it, straight to the bottom of the Roadless Wash. The financing, which had been shaky all along, died that night. Amity was never built. The rails already laid were pulled up and sold to pay the creditors, which is exactly what happened to a bankrupt western spur. The iron was worth more sold off than left in the ground, and that is how the engine came to be marooned in a canyon with no rail in or out. And the valley, ruined, grieving, looking for a face to hate, was handed one. Ambrose Merrick stood up in the county seat and said the wreck was the engineer's fault. Careless, reckless, too much speed on a green trestle. Hale wrecked us, he said, and the valley, needing it to be true, believed him. And the name Hale went into the dirt and stayed there 30 years. But it was a lie, Josie said. It was not a question. She had felt the shape of it coming. It was a lie, Silas said. And your grandfather could prove it. That is the part he sealed away. That is the part I have been guarding. Merrick did not lose that trestle to a flood or to speed. Merrick brought it down himself, on purpose, with an axe and a saw, because he needed the line to fail. He had a reason, and your grandfather, who went down with that engine and should have died and did not, crawled out of this canyon knowing exactly what he had seen. And knowing that no soul in that valley would take a wrecker's word over a rich man's. So he did not speak. He waited. He hid the proof where fire could not burn it, and thieves would not think to look, and he hid the bell with it, and he lit a fire every night for the rest of his life, so that no scrap dealer would ever haul this engine away before the day the truth could be told. Josie looked up at the empty bell yoke, black against the darkening sky, and finally she understood why it was empty. The bell is inside her, she said softly. Isn't it? He hid the bell inside the engine. Silas nodded slowly. Inside the one iron room fire will not touch, and no thief will ever open, he said. The cold boiler. You reach it through the smoke box, up front, behind the number plate. 30 years I have kept the outside of her alive, girl, and I have never once opened the inside. That was never mine to open. It was always going to be yours. They opened her the next morning, in the clean gold light, because Silas said a thing like this should be done by daylight and not by lantern, and Josie was glad of it after, though she could not have said why. The smoke box door was a great round iron plate at the very front of the engine, under the headlamp, dogged shut, with a ring of bolts gone stiff, with 30 years of rust. Silas had oil for them. Of course he did. He had spent 3 decades making sure that when this door was finally opened, it would open. They worked the bolts loose, one by one, the old man and the girl, neither of them saying much, and when the last one gave, the great door swung out on its hinge with a long, low groan that rolled around the canyon walls and came back to them. Inside the smoke box, where the draft and the char should have been, there was a wall. A second iron wall her grandfather had cut and fitted and riveted into place himself, sealing off the front of the boiler barrel into a chamber, a dry iron room deep within the machine, exactly as Silas had said. And set into that wall another small hatch, and this one was not rusted, because it had been greased against this day for 30 years. Josie put her hands on it. She looked at Silas. He nodded. And she opened it and reached in, and the canyon held its breath. Straw. Her hand met straw first, old and dry and packed tight, and then something curved and cool and enormous under the straw, and she knew it before she cleared it. She knew by the size and the shape and the deep hum it gave when her knuckle brushed it. Bronze, she and Silas worked the straw away for the better share of an hour, and then the two of them together, straining, drew it out into the light. The bell. It was beautiful. 30 years in the dark had not touched it. A great bronze church bell the color of a dark penny, taller than a barrel. Its lip broad enough to ring a man deaf, and around its shoulder, cast into the metal itself, a line of raised letters that Amity had ordered 1,000 miles away for a steeple it never built. Josie brushed the straw dust from the words and read them aloud, and her voice broke on them, there in the bottom of the canyon that had swallowed her family's name. Let the valley hear, she read, and know it is home. It had never rung, not once. Cast for a town that died the night it arrived, freighted across a continent to hang in the dark of a dead engine for 30 years. A voice that had never in all its life been allowed to make a sound. And Josie thought of the old teamster at the auction and understood him at last. Here was a voice never once allowed to sound in all its life, and still it had kept its own note true. It had been down here the whole time, holding that one sound, waiting there was a packet with it, sealed in oilcloth and wax, tucked into the straw against the bell's cold side, and written on the outside in a hand Josie now knew from 30 years of dusk entries, her grandfather's hand. Were the words, "For the one who comes to ring it." She held it, and she did not open it. She has told people since that she does not fully know why. Maybe she was afraid. Maybe she wanted the moment to belong to her a little longer before it belonged to whatever was written there. Maybe she already sensed that once that seal was broken, there would be no going back to being a girl who could still walk away. Whatever it was, she sat down on the cracked mud with the great silent bell beside her and the sealed packet in her lap, and she meant to open it that evening. She never got the chance to open it in peace, because that same afternoon the dust came up the wash, not wind. Riders, 3 of them, picking their careful way down through the slot on hired mules, and at the head of them a soft, heavy man in a good gray suit, gone dark at the collar with sweat, with a leather case across his saddle and a paper in his hand. He drew up at the edge of the basin and looked at the engine and then at the bell gleaming in the sun beside it. And something moved behind his face that was not surprise. It was hunger. "You would be the Hale girl," he said, and it was not friendly. "My name is Coyle. I am the appointed receiver for the assets of the Redstone and Western Railroad, in bankruptcy these 30 years. He held up the paper. "This is a writ out of the district court. That locomotive is unredeemed rolling stock, the property of the railroad's estate. And I am here to seize it and everything sealed within it, and sell it for the estate's creditors, including," and his eyes went again to the bronze bell. "That, whatever that is. Step away from the property, girl. Now here is where a lesser story would give you a gunfight, and where this valley, for 30 years, would have expected the wrecker's blood to lose again. It did not go that way. Josie Hale stood up, and she was frightened, and she did not run. "You are too late by 30 years to want this engine," she said. "Nobody wanted it. I bought it fair at the county tax sale. $7. There is a bill of sale with the county clerk with my name on it. A tax sale cannot sell what the county never owned," Coyle said smoothly, and he swung down off his mule, folding the writ. "The engine was never the county's to auction. It is railroad property, and railroad property comes to the estate, and the estate comes to me. Your $7 bought you air, girl. Now stand aside before these men have to move you. And that would have been the end of it, the law itself handing the last Hale one more defeat. Except that at that exact moment, a fourth rider came down out of the slot at an easy walk. An older man with a tin star on his vest and a face that gave away nothing, and Coyle's smooth certainty stumbled for just a breath. "Afternoon," the newcomer said. "Josie Hale? Silas sent word to town 3 days back that you'd come. I'm the United States Marshal for this district." Dunmore, he looked at Coyle without warmth. "And I know this, gentleman. Go on and read your writ, Coyle, but you'll read it slow, and you'll read it in front of me, because the last time the Redstone estate came out to this canyon, it came out lying, and I have got a long memory." For a moment, nobody moved. Coyle's 2 hired men shifted in their saddles and looked at the tin star on Dunmore's vest and did the same arithmetic every hired man learns to do, weighing a day's pay against a federal charge, and Josie watched them decide they were not paid enough for this. Silas came and stood beside her, this old half-deaf man who had guarded a dead engine for 3 decades, and he did not say a word. But he set himself between the girl and the riders as if his worn body were still worth something as a wall. And Josie, who had walked into that canyon with nothing and no one, understood that she was not standing alone anymore. Whatever the paper in Coyle's hand said, she had a marshal on one side of her and a keeper on the other, and behind them both, silent and enormous. The engine her grandfather had never stopped believing in. What happened next happened in the open, in front of witnesses, on the floor of the canyon. And not one shot was fired, and that is exactly how Josie's grandfather would have wanted the truth to finally come out. Because Silas, who had been waiting 30 years for a man with a badge to stand in this basin, went into the cab and brought out the iron box, and out of the iron box along with the log, he brought the thing Ezra Hale had sealed away with the bell. It was a bundle of papers, dry and yellow, and 2 things fell out of it into the daylight. The first was a document with a printed letterhead and a great deal of fine copperplate, and the marshal took it and read it, and his jaw went tight. "Coyle," he said, "you want to explain this to me, because this here is a claim of insurance filed with the Territorial Mutual 1869, 3 weeks after this engine went into the canyon, filed by the railroad over the signature of its financier, one Ambrose Merrick. And it is not a claim for a damaged engine, it is a claim for a total loss. The whole line. The trestle, the rails, the rolling stock, this locomotive, declared a total and complete loss and paid out in full." He looked up. "You know what a total loss payout means, Coyle? Every man in this territory that has ever insured a wagon knows it. When the company pays you for a total loss, the company takes title. The wreck stops being yours the day you cash their draft. Merrick collected on this engine as a dead total loss 30 years ago, which means the railroad gave up every claim it ever had to it that same day. It was not the county's to sell, I will grant you that, but it was surely not the estate's to seize. By your own founder's own hand, this engine has not belonged to that railroad since 1869. A man cannot be paid for a thing as lost forever and then send you out to haul it back and sell it twice." There was a silence in the canyon. Coyle's soft face had gone the color of the mud. "That document is 30 years old," he said. "It proves nothing. A clerical matter. The girl has no standing to. That paper could be a forgery. It could be. It could be, the marshal agreed, except for the second thing. And he held up what had fallen out with the claim. And it was not paper at all. It was a photograph, an old wet plate photograph gone brown, and beside it a short sworn statement in Ezra Hale's schoolteacher hand. The photograph showed a length of heavy trestle timber salvaged from the wreck and dragged up onto the mesa. And the timber had been photographed against a surveyor's rule so the scale could not be argued. And the end of that timber did not show the long, ragged splinter of green wood snapped by a flood or by too much weight. It showed a face flat and clean and square. It showed the bright, unmistakable curve of a saw. Somebody had cut that trestle 3/4 through with a saw and finished it with an axe, so that the first heavy engine to cross it would bring the whole span down, and no one would ever look past the flood and the falling water to ask why good new timber had failed. Cut, not broken, the marshal said quietly, and every man there understood him, because on the frontier the difference between cut timber and broken timber had hanged more than one man and cleared more than one, and a jury could see it as plain as Josie could. Your Mr. Merrick did not lose this line to an accident, Coyle. He took an axe and a saw to his own trestle, and he brought it down under an honest man at the throttle. And he collected a total loss on the whole ruined dream, while a valley full of families lost everything they had ever saved. And then he handed them a wrecker to hate, so nobody would come looking for the saw. That is what your estate has been sitting on for 30 years. That is what you rode out here to seize and bury for good. Coyle tried once more to make it go the old way. He drew himself up and he said the estate would contest it, that a dead man's papers proved nothing, that the girl was a vagrant and the old man was mad and the county had no jurisdiction, and he said all of it loudly and fast, the way a man talks when he can feel the ground going out from under him. And the marshal let him finish, every word in front of the witnesses. And then he simply took the writ out of Coyle's hand and folded it in half. "You'll ride back to the county seat with me," Dunmore said, "and you'll bring these papers, and you will file them. Because a fraud does not stop being a fraud just because the man who did it is 30 years dead and his family would rather it stayed quiet. There will be no seizing here. This engine belongs to Josie Hale, bought fair for $7, and everything sealed inside it belongs to her too. And the name of the man they called a wrecker is going to be read back into the record clean." He touched his hat to Josie. "Miss Hale, looks to me like your grandfather left the county some reading to do." And that was how the truth of the Redstone wreck came out. Not in a gunfight, not in a speech. In the flat noonlight of a roadless canyon, out of a dead man's own iron box, proved by a photograph of a cut timber and a rich man's own greedy claim of loss, in front of a United States Marshal who had waited as long for it as Silas had. The powerful family that still ran that county could not stop it, because the proof was in their founder's own hand. And Josie Hale, who had walked into that canyon the granddaughter of a wrecker, stood in it now the granddaughter of an honest man. But she had still not opened the packet for the one who comes to ring it. It sat in her lap all through the long business with Coyle, and only that evening, when the riders were gone and the fire was lit and the great bell sat gleaming beside the engine that had hidden it, did Silas nod at her across the flames, and did Josie Hale finally break her grandfather's seal. Inside was his account of the wreck, the whole of it, written out plain and dated and signed. The same account Silas had told her, set down in a dead man's careful hand so that it could never be argued into silence. That was the proof, and the county would have it, and it would do its work. But that was not what made Josie weep, there by the fire, with the great bell listening. What made her weep was the letter folded around the proof, because the letter was not addressed to a court or a county. It was addressed to her. She read it aloud to Silas, slowly, because he had earned every word of it. To the child of my blood who comes at last to open this, she read, I do not know your name. I will never know your face. I know only that you will come, because a thing this heavy does not stay buried forever, and blood finds its own. So I am writing to you across all the years between us. They will have told you that I wrecked the line. They will have made our name a hard thing to carry, and I am sorry for it, sorrier than I have words. But I could not clear it in my own life. A wrecker's word against a rich man's is worth nothing. And if I had wrung the truth out too soon, they would only have smashed the bell and burned the papers and buried me deeper, and you would have had nothing to come home to. So I did the only thing a ruined man could do. I kept the fire so no one would haul her away. I hid the bell where nothing could destroy it. And I waited for you. The bell was never meant to hang empty. Its yoke stands bare because the bell had to live in the dark until there was someone to ring it into the light. That someone is you. Ring it, child. Let the valley hear and know it is home. For a long while neither of them said anything. The fire cracked. The bell held its one waiting note in the dark, and Josie understood, finally, the whole shape of what she had been given, and how little of it was iron and bronze. Her grandfather had not left her a fortune. There was no gold in that engine. There never had been. What he had left her was a name made clean, and a voice for a valley that had lost its own, and a purpose, handed down through 30 years of dusk fires and one faithful old man, to the one person born low enough and stubborn enough to carry it. He had chosen her before she was born. He had kept a light burning in a hole in the ground for 30 years against the day his own blood would walk down into it and understand. That was the treasure. That was the thing sealed inside the worthless engine in the roadless canyon. Not money. Belonging a place. A name she could stand up straight inside of. They did not ring the bell in the canyon. Josie thought about it. That night, the two of them alone with the thing that had waited 30 years, and it would have been easy to hang it on the engine's own bare yoke and pull the crank and be done. But that was not what her grandfather had asked of her. The bell had been cast for a town, and a town, however ruined, however far from finished, was where it had to sing. So they did the harder, slower, better thing. Word of the cut timber went to the county seat with the marshal, and the account in Ezra Hale's own hand was read into the record. And it moved through that valley slowly at first and then all at once, as the truth does when a place has been half, waiting 30 years to be allowed to believe it. Old men who had lost their fathers' farms to the ruin came out to the land office to read the papers for themselves. The story that had put the Hale name in the dirt turned over in a single season, and the shame that had scattered Josie's family lifted off of it like smoke off a dead fire. Nobody could give the families back the savings the wreck had cost them. Merrick was long dead, and the money was long spent, and the town of Amity was never going to rise on its mesa. Some wrongs are too old to be paid back in coin, but there was one thing the valley could still do, and it did it. They built the church. Not on the mesa where Amity was meant to stand, but down in the living part of the valley where the people actually were. A small, plain, weight-framed church raised by the hands of the very families the wreck had ruined, and they raised a steeple on it, and they left the steeple empty, waiting, because everyone in that valley now knew what was coming to fill it. It took the better part of a year. Josie stayed the whole time. She had nowhere else she wanted to be, and for the first time in her life. Nowhere else that anyone wanted her to be either. She and Silas found a way to bring the bell up out of the canyon, not the engine. The engine stayed where it belonged, tilted and honest on its canyon floor, but the bell they eased up the wash on a sledge over many patient days. The same slow country that had marooned it, giving it up at last one careful yard at a time. On the day they hung it, the whole valley came. They came in wagons and on foot and on horseback, the families who had cursed the name Hale for 30 years, and they filled the ground around that little white church and its waiting steeple, and they were quiet. Because nobody quite knew how you apologized to a girl for 30 years of hating a man she never met. Josie did not need the apology. She stood at the foot of the steeple in a clean dress with Silas beside her, the old keeper leaning on her arm now, half deaf and wholly content, and she watched them raise the great bronze bell up into the tower on ropes, the letters catching the sun, that old promise cast into the bronze, and she thought her heart would not hold it. Then they gave her the rope. They had all agreed on that without anyone having to say it. A Hale had kept the bell safe. A Hale would give it its voice. And Josie Hale, 18 years old, who 3 seasons back had owned $7 and a cursed name and no bed in all the world, took the rope of a bell that had crossed a continent and waited 30 years in the dark, and she pulled. The note it gave was enormous. It rolled out over that valley, deep and bronze and clean, the sound the whole country had been promised in 1869 and cheated of, and it went out across the red rock, and the dry fields and the graves of the families the wreck had broken, and it came back off the canyon walls doubled, so that for a moment it seemed the whole territory was ringing. It had never made a sound in its life. Now it could not stop. She rang it, and grown men who had lost everything took their hats off and wept, and the bell that never rang until that day finally learned, at long last, the note it had been holding in silence since before Josie was born. When at last she let the rope go still, an old man came forward out of the crowd, the oldest soul in that whole valley, bent nearly double over a cane, who had been a boy of 5 the autumn the line went down, and had watched his father lose the farm and everything on it. He took Josie's hand in both of his, and his hands shook, and for a moment he could not speak at all. "I called your grandfather a wrecker," he said finally, and his voice cracked clean through. "My whole life I called him that. My father died calling him that. And all this time he was down in that hole keeping our bell warm for us." He could not finish. Josie folded his shaking hands in hers and told him, gently, so the whole quiet crowd could hear it, that a man who is sorry out loud has already been forgiven, and that her grandfather had never wanted the valley's guilt, only its ear, for one clear ringing minute which it had finally given him. Somebody near her said it, softly, and she heard it and smiled, because she had been waiting the whole season to hear an old truth come round to its ending. A bell that had never rung, they said, still knew its own note all along. She never took a fee for any of it. There were men from the territorial papers who came wanting to buy the story, and a lawyer or two who explained, kindly, that a clever girl could likely sue the Merrick estate for a great deal of money over what its founder had done, and Josie thanked them all and turned them all down. She had not done it for money, and she was not going to end it with money, because she had learned the one thing her grandfather most wanted her to know, that the valuable thing and the costly thing are not always the same thing, and a name you can stand up inside of is worth more than any sum a court could name. She stayed. Of course she stayed. She became the keeper of the fire, as Silas had been before her and Ezra before him, though the vigil was a gentler thing now, no longer a lonely guard over a buried truth, but a kind of tending, a remembering. She kept the little church, and she kept the engine in the canyon, walking down to it in the long evenings, and she kept the log. That was the part that mattered most to her. Every dusk she opened the iron box, and she took up the pencil where 2 dead men and 1 living one had left off, and she wrote the day's single line under 30 years of her grandfather's hand and Silas's, adding hers to theirs, the vigil unbroken. The words were different now. There was no truth left waiting. The truth was wrung out and clean. So she wrote what was true instead. The fire was lit. The bell had a home. The valley had heard. The bell was never the treasure. The voice it gave back was. Silas lived 3 more good years, and Josie was with him at the end, and he went easy, a man who had finished the one job his whole long life had been given. And there was one last thing, a small thing, that Josie kept for herself and never read aloud to anyone. Not to the valley, not to the papers, not even, in the end, to Silas. On the very last page of her grandfather's log, after the final dusk entry in his hand, there was one more line he had written, meant for no court and no crowd. Meant only for the child of his blood who would one day sit where he had sat and read it alone. What it said was between Josie Hale and the grandfather she never met, and she carried it the rest of her days, and she never told, and I am not going to tell you either, because some things a person leaves you are meant to stay yours. That is the story of the engine that fell into the roadless canyon, and the bell that waited so long in silence, and the girl who was chosen before she was born to give a valley back its voice. Thank you for staying with us right to the last of it. If Josie's story warmed something in you tonight, take a moment to leave a like and let us know which part stayed with you, the empty yoke or the cut timber, or the day the whole valley came to hear the bell. And if you would, subscribe and sit with us again by the next fire for another tale out of the forgotten frontier. Before you go, sit with the choice Josie was handed, because it was never really only hers. If it had been you down in that canyon, holding a bell that could clear a dead man's name, but bring the powerful down on your own head, would you have wrung it out that very first night and let the chips fall? Or would you have done the harder thing and waited, as Ezra Hale waited, for the day the truth could ring beside it? Tell us. We will be listening. And until we meet again by the next fire, be good to the overlooked things and to the overlooked people, because you never can tell what patient worth is waiting, quiet as a bell in the dark, for someone to come and set it ringing.